A major bull escalation is underway on the Treasury curve. The reason? The economy continues to show clear and convincing signs of falling off. We've got rising unemployment, panicky central bankers, both current and former, even high-end consumers are pulling back in a big way. Just today, earnings from global consumer giant LVMH reaffirmed what we've already heard from, say, Target and Walmart, among so many others, with Walmart actually benefiting from higher income shoppers being forced to seek bargains. That same trend hit LVMH squarely. And the company specifically highlighted the two primary hotspots for weakness that I do, the US and China. When luxury goods makers are warning their luxury goods customers in those places aren't shopping so much, you know it's really getting serious. Even the former head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York agrees. Today, he urged the Fed to cut rates now. Do it next week rather than do what it always does and wait until it's too late. Not that rate cuts are going to help, as I showed in a recent video, they never do. They only point out that it's too late and the downturn has become so substantial that even the blind can then see it. So we've got bull steepening on the curve. We've got weakness in high-end consumers. We've got former Federal Reserve officials saying cut rates now. We've got current central bankers in Canada saying we are cutting rates now and there are more on the way. All because the weakness is becoming more and more pronounced. And the markets absolutely agree. So what we're seeing here is more pronounced bull steepening on the Treasury curve. And just to review what bull steepening is, while nominal rates are moving lower, the front end of the curve, the short-term rates tend to move lower farther and faster than those at the long end. This tells us that the market is becoming more pessimistic, not just about future prospects, but more immediate prospects, expecting that interest rates are going to go down in the near term and maybe stay down for longer. That's why the curve falls, the interest rates fall more generally. But with the short-term rates going down farther than the long-term rates, the curve uninverts and actually begins to steepen out. That's why it's called steepening. And the reason we call it bull steepening is because it's bullish for anyone owning U.S. Treasuries or other forms of safety and liquidity. It's actually bearish for everyone else, so I hate the term bull steepening because it's not really bullish. It's actually a very bearish signal. And as I said, if we do get bull steepening here, a more decisive move, which appears to be forming in the marketplace, it's also a timing signal that the rubber has finally hit the road where the fears over a potential recession are no longer fears, they're starting to become reality, widespread reality that's recognized in a lot of different places that maybe you wouldn't normally expect, as we'll see in just a moment. So what we have is, over the last couple months, we've had some head fakes on bull steepening, which is not unusual. The market always swings back and forth. And what we've been waiting for is a more decisive signal that it was going to stick around this time. And that's right where we are today. Really, the last couple days, the market has made a pretty substantial move. The 2-year U.S. Treasury yield before I started recording was down to 4.38%. That's a new multi-month low. At the same time, the 10-year U.S. Treasury, which had been lower, has backed up a little bit from its more recent low over the last week, and now at 422 this morning. That puts the 2-year, 10-year spread at around 15 or 16 basis points, which the last time we saw that was in late January. But the spread that narrow, inverted in late January, was more about bear steepening than bull steepening. So the 2-year, 10-year spread this time is narrowing, less inverted, but in the bull steepening fashion. The 5-year U.S. Treasury has fallen all the way to 4.1% as of this morning. The 5-year, 10-year spread, which is one that I point out all the time, that's in the middle part of the curve where a lot of business gets done, a lot of finance goes on in the middle. That 5-year, 10-year spread has uninverted more recently, and now that uninversion, this steepening, has become even more pronounced. It's now at 12 basis points as of this morning, which equals late January. But again, that was the bear case, not the bull case. But now this 12 basis points in the bull direction is higher than late October and November last year, just when the bond rally was getting started. So we're getting a decisive move in the middle part of the curve. The 30-year U.S. Treasury is basically hanging in there like the 10s. The long end of the curve over the last week has been largely steady as the short end, short to middle, is moving lower. With the 30-year at 447, the 2-year 30-year spread, which had uninverted for a day back on July 15th, as I pointed out, that's now fully uninverted to a positive spread of 9 basis points. So that one looks like it's sticking around too. So that's what we're getting, more and more signals on the Treasury curve where some of these uninversions and steepenings are indeed sticking around. Not just sticking around, in some of them, like the 5-year 10-year spread and maybe the 2-year 10-year spread, they're making more decisive moves in that direction. So this is something we need to keep a close eye on, especially if it continues to make even more decisive moves in that same direction. Which is surprising a lot of people because while we get lots of information from the mainstream media, we don't know how to make sense of it because it's all based on economics. And economics gets so much of this backwards and wrong. And that's why Eurodollar University has memberships and subscriptions. So you can not only stay on top of what's happening, but just as important, understand what it all means. Let's face it, while there's lots of useful information, economics leaves you with no way to make sense of it. Most of what you hear about the state of the economy, what interest rates are doing or might do, what money even is, what you hear is just nonsense. So we are in the final days of our anniversary sale. And a huge thank you to everyone who participated last night in our live stream. It was a huge success. And it really was a lot of fun as we had a really deep discussions among all the participants. Among other things we found out, you'll learn why the movie Home Alone is lying to you about what really happens to children who get left home alone. So big thank you to George Gammon, Jim Rickards, Mike Green, Brent Johnson, Eric Basmajian, Steve Van Meter from Disney, and a special thanks to my old co-host Emil Kalinowski for spending a couple hours and going through all of this stuff. A replay of the live stream is available right here at our Eurodollar University YouTube channel, as well as for members and subscribers at the membership website. So today it was LVMH's turn to turn in some big-time consumer warnings. This time, because it's one of the world's largest luxury makers, we're talking about higher-end consumers. Not necessarily the ultra-rich, but those who are higher income and classified as maybe comfortable. Suddenly, those who were comfortable may not be all that much moving forward. So the world's largest luxury consumer goods group, and the stock is taking a beating after missing on quarterly earnings. Their sales were reported at just less than 21 billion euros, which were expected to be about 21.6 billion euros. And the company said they had a huge drop in sales outside of Japan, which largely targets the Chinese. And the reason the Japanese sales surge is because wealthier Chinese who were able were flocking to Japan to buy stuff with a cheaper yen. There's also a big slump in apparently wine and spirits, champagne most of all. That division for LVMH, revenues were down 5%. Jewelry is down 4%. So luxury goods maker, one of the largest in the world, the largest in the world, saying some of our luxury goods consumers just aren't able to shop, especially in the US and China. What the company's statement actually said was Europe, along with the United States and China, were the regions most affected by, quote, lower consumer demand, before adding that the market environment in China has been, quote, unfavorable. The industry downturn is being felt because both major drivers of demand, the US and China, have slowed. The second quarter compares with the period a year ago when China emerged from lockdowns and consumers were revenge spending once more. Now shoppers are more cautious amid a deepening property slump, perhaps explaining why they are so keen to save their splurging for those trips to Japan. Meanwhile, U.S. middle-class spenders remain under pressure from high inflation and higher borrowing costs. No, not so much borrowing costs. That really doesn't have much of an impact. It does in certain sectors, but mostly it's lost purchasing power and rising unemployment, more uncertainty in the labor market, tough opportunities. People understand that if they lose their job, if they get cut in hours, they don't really have much choice. And those who are looking for a job, they just can't find one. So the labor market softening is having a major impact, especially on these comfortable consumers, because a lot of that softening has been focused on white-collar types of jobs. So we got weakness all over the comfortable segment of the consumer marketplace, which tells you, first of all, of how widespread and serious this economic problem is, but what must that also mean for those below them on the income spectrum? They're already suffering from consumer prices' lost purchasing power. And now with rising unemployment, it just leads to a toxic mix that we start to associate more clearly and more visibly with recession. Among those who are associating this weakness more clearly and more visibly with recession, former head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Bill Dudley. Now, Bill Dudley was at the center of a whole bunch during the great not financial crisis. Tends to be your traditional, conventional central banker, as in he's a perfect example of what data dependent really means. He doesn't make any insightful forecasts or understand how things work. He just reacts to whatever the latest data point is. So over the last couple of years, Dudley has been what he readily admits as a ultra hawk. In other words, someone who's been more reactive and more responsive to past CPI numbers than the looming weakness in the background that we've been seeing coming since last September and October. Here's what Dudley wrote today in Bloomberg. I've been in the higher for longer camp, insisting that the U.S. Federal Reserve must hold short-term interest rates at the current level or higher to get inflation under control. The facts have changed. So I've changed my mind. See, that's the thing. The facts haven't changed. The data has changed to better reflect these changing circumstances. The Fed should cut, Dudley wrote, preferably at next week's policy meeting. Just as I argued not long ago with the labor market data, particularly the unemployment rate, the Federal Reserve should really talk about cutting rates. If they believe what they believe about rate cuts, then they should be talking about cutting rates at the next meeting. The July rate cut should be in play, as Dudley is urging, but as we know, as Dudley said in his op-ed, that's not going to happen because policymakers are too afraid of the CPI, and they still believe that there's strength and resiliency in the economy. The reason why Dudley is no longer so sure about that, as he writes here, most troubling, the 3-month average unemployment rate is up 0.43 percentage point from its low point in the prior 12 months, very close to the 0.5 threshold that, as identified by the SOM rule, which I've gone over, has invariably signaled a U.S. recession. Although it might be already too late to fend off a recession by cutting rates, dawdling now unnecessarily increases the risk, and those are Dudley's words. So a July rate cut should be in play, but policymakers will likely not cut rates because they're still more afraid of the CPI and they're still more convinced of strong and resilient labor markets. Even when it comes to the unemployment rate, as Dudley pointed out, there's this idea throughout the mainstream, spreading throughout the mainstream, that it's a good rise in unemployment, that the labor force is growing, that people are pouring into the labor force, and there's just not enough jobs to absorb that increase in labor availability. Therefore, the unemployment rate is rising, not because companies are laying people off, because they're just not hiring as many people as that are entering the labor force. And while that was true last year, the data shows it has not been true in quite some time. You have to wonder, do people actually look at the data and statistics? As I pointed out every time we get the payroll numbers, the labor force is actually up only a small amount since last September, just 112,000. The population, the civilian non-institutional population over that same time has gone up by 1 million. So the labor force increasing by 112,000, already the idea of good unemployment doesn't fit with the actual data. Employment, or the amount of employees measured by the household survey, in that same period of time has fallen by 351,000. Has fallen by 351,000. So the official number of unemployed has only increased by 464,000 since September, but it really should have gone up by an additional 570,000. So this is not a case of good unemployment. This is a case of companies cutting back a little bit on their employees, and those who would enter the labor force realize there's not any jobs for them to go out and look for them. So they fall out of the labor force. It's the same thing that we always see preceding a recession. The idea that it's reflecting some positive trends is just a rationalization, but one that Dudley correctly points out the Federal Reserve officials are going to use. They are not using it over in Canada. The Bank of Canada cut rates for the second straight meeting just today, too. Remember, it had been the Swiss National Bank a couple months ago that surprised when it started cutting rates. And the reason the Swiss National Bank started cutting rates was because they said, we see the downside in the global economy happening. And as it does happen, and as more central bankers are able to recognize it, that means that central banks around the world are going to start cutting. So the Swiss National Bank cut to get ahead of everyone else. And that's exactly where we are. We're starting to see the tide turn and everything shift. We're going to have globally synchronized rate cuts too. The Canadians are among the leaders in that process as well. Our old buddy Tiff Macklem from the Bank of Canada. Here's what the Wall Street Journal said of the Bank of Canada's decision today. It delivered a second straight cut to its main interest rate after a quarter-point reduction in June and signaled there is likely more to come as officials grow increasingly worried about downside economic risks. It's not just about Canada or one place or the other. Like LVMH was saying, US and China as well as Europe. It's basically the entire world is feeling the effects of the downturn and the supply shock, the downside of the supply shock. As the BOC said in its statement, in the United States, the anticipated economic slowdown is materializing with consumption growth moderating. And then they continued about Canada. Household spending, including both consumer purchases and housing, has been weak. There are signs of slack in the labor market. The unemployment rate has risen to 6.4%. That's something that I pointed out recently as well. But the Canadians, like their American counterparts, are trying to blame their rise in unemployment on good unemployment. As they wrote, employment continues to grow more slowly than the labor force, job seekers taking longer to find work. So it's not about mass layoffs, it's just the economy has slowed down and unemployment rises. To his credit, Bill Dudley pointed out that it doesn't actually matter. Even during the 1970s, when the labor force was growing rapidly, a rise in the unemployment rate usually signaled recession. In fact, it signaled recession every single time. You didn't need the Somme rule or any other type of mathematical construction to understand what was happening. So the Treasury curve is making its bull move here, and it's becoming more decisive. And you can understand why that is. We continue to get warnings from all over the world and all over various parts of the economy. In this case, high-end consumer goods. Warning about US and China, widespread weakness. We've got rate cuts from a central bank today, the Bank of Canada, cutting repeatedly, saying they're going to continue to cut because of weakness. We've got former central bankers like the former head of the FRBNY who says, I am now a former hawk and now a dove because I see that circumstances have changed. The data now more clearly reflects the risks are to the downside of the economy. Because overall, this continues to be the same cycle. As we've been saying all along, the cycle continues to play out. More and more, the data becomes like the cycle playing out, less and less like inflation, strength, and resilience, and everything else that you've heard. Everything that the market has been pricing all along as a future risk is becoming our current reality. And the evidence for it is increasingly everywhere. So we continue to get bull steepening in the Treasury market. We're going to get more rate cuts around the world. We're going to get rate cuts from the Federal Reserve. We're going to hear more from Federal Reserve officials and former officials who are urging even more because the downside of the supply shock is finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. Rate cuts, they're coming, but they don't work. They've never worked. It's all superstition. And you don't have to take my word for it. Find out why in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Thank you again to everybody who participated in our live stream. Check out Eurodollar University's anniversary sale, final days there. Thanks to members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.